Chapter 10, Journey to Death. It was several weeks after we heard the story of the waterfall when Grandfather told us the story of the second half of its teaching, the journey to Death Valley. Ironically, we were walking along the trail, once again that we called drudgery, heading back to camp when we sat down for a while to rest. Our trek was even more torturous than it had been a few weeks earlier, though the conditions were essentially the same. In fact, I believe that it was a little hotter and drier than it had been on our previous trip, even dustier. The thirst I felt was nothing like I had ever experienced. My lips were so dry that they were cracked. Some of the cracks ran so deep that they would bleed. My throat and lungs were so dry and filled with dust that I could barely cough. There was no moisture left in them to move any of the dust. Rick and I just lay in the sparse shade along the trail, panting and dizzy. Grandfather, as always, looked so serene. He busied himself with some lizard tracks that stretched across the hot sands and into the low blueberry bushes along the trail. He sat with us, not because he was tired, but to keep us company as we tried to recuperate. I felt like I could not possibly go on, but I had no choice. The camp, and subsequently the water, were not going to come to me. So, too, was there no way that I could last out the day and travel at night to camp. My thirst was far too intense to linger here for very long. As usual, I paid no attention to any of the marvelous things that were all around me. I was too wrapped up in my pain and thirst. That thirst became like a vacuum that sucked in all my awareness and cast me into a deep stupor. Even though I knew that I had no choice but to head back to camp, I still grumbled to myself as Grandfather got up to leave. He walked off with a certain spring in his step that really made me angry. Again, it was not anger at him, but at myself for being so weak and allowing the thirst and pain to rule my life once again. I wanted to be like Grandfather, but I had no idea how to go about changing my attitude toward the intense heat and thirst. Certainly Grandfather had told me many times before that I should not give these things any power over me, but that seemed easier said than done. I was determined at this point, midway through the trek, to find out more about how Grandfather was able to handle the heat with such ease. As usual, by the time we reached the outer perimeter of camp, Rick and I were running to the water. At this point, I still had enough resolve to honor the water and to pray before I dove in, but even my prayers of thanksgiving were rushed. As usual, Grandfather proceeded with his slow approach to the water and prolonged prayers of thanksgiving, and the touch that connected him to all the waters. As usual, too, the thirst did not seem to be a factor to him at all, not even an inconvenience. In fact, I imagined that to Grandfather the thirst was kind of a blessing, but I did not know why. To me, he looked as if he was rather pleased to be thirsty. Rick and I lingered in and around the water for the remainder of the afternoon just to regain our strength and to fully hydrate. We did not return to camp until dusk, and even then I was still dragging with fatigue. The whole thing was just making me so angry. I again had missed so much because of the smothering encapsulation of thirst. My actions at camp, kicking at stumps and carelessly tossing things about, made my anger very obvious. So too was Rick feeling that same anger. I looked over to where Grandfather was sitting, and I was startled to see him looking back at me. He had that smile on his face that told me the fact that he knew exactly what I was feeling, and he somehow sympathized with my plight. I also knew that smile to mean that he too had gone through that same anger at one time in his life, and I suspect that is why he told us the story of Death Valley on this night. There was not much conversation until later on in the night, and then, without any prompting, Grandfather began to speak about what we were feeling. He said, "You are angry at yourself for giving into the pain, the thirst, and the heat. By giving that pain and thirst power over you, you have seen or experienced nothing other than that thirst. You have cut yourself off from all things because of that power, and you walked as if dead. Yet you knew that you would soon come to water, but you would not release your pain. Instead, you held on to the pain and thirst like old friends. You could not set that aside, even for a few moments. You chose to live in a vacuum of pain, thirst, and ultimately self-pity. You could have learned what the thirst was trying to teach you, and then let it go, but you would not learn its lessons. Thus, you must face the thirst time and time again until you learn what they have to teach. Only then can you transcend your thirst and remove its power." I sat in silence for a long time, trying to understand what Grandfather was talking about. I had no idea what he meant when he said that I was holding on to the thirst and pain like old friends. I also had no idea what lesson I was supposed to learn from the thirst. How could anyone learn anything from thirst other than to appreciate the waters even more? Grandfather's voice broke into my thoughts, saying, "Thirst is a gift to be cherished and understood, for thirst will lead you to a deeper understanding of life. It is only when we can learn the lessons of thirst that we can truly understand life. Thirst is not a demon, but a blessing. It is a reality that is like an island in the world of the unreal." I sort of knew what Grandfather was talking about, but I had no idea about how to find the deeper lessons. I remembered back to a time when Grandfather was sitting out in front of my house waiting for me. It was a hot, hazy, and humid August afternoon, yet Grandfather sat serenely, as usual, with a delightful smile on his face. A neighbor who was passing by asked Grandfather why he never seemed to be affected by either the heat or the cold. I had been amazed at Grandfather's answer. He simply said, "Because they are real." At first I did not understand that answer, but as the months passed I realized the power of what he had said. In a world of cloistered society where most living and working environments are unreal and sterile, the reality of nature is a welcome relief. But I still could not understand why Grandfather had said that my thirst was a gift. After all, I did live in the reality of nature, and the thirst would not, as far as I was concerned, teach me much more reality. It was then that Grandfather told Rick and me the story of Death Valley. Grandfather said that soon after he had left the site of the waterfall that he knew he had to go into Death Valley. The thoughts of the trek into the valley grew stronger and more compelling with each passing mile. Even before he had entirely left the jungle, all he could think about were the hot, arid deserts. He knew that the lessons learned at the waterfall could not fully be understood until he went to the desert. He instinctively knew that he could not understand the deeper wisdom until he learned the lessons of both extremes. He did not linger long in any one place. Instead, he built camp only when he was forced to replenish his supplies. He would travel for 4 days, sleeping only on the bare ground, and then would camp for 2 days to replenish his supplies. The trek was, in fact, rushed, driven by the desire to reach the deserts by midsummer. As he passed through the northern regions of Mexico, he did not even consider stopping to see his people. The quest to get to the desert even precluded the visiting of his own tribe. Though the urge was there to see his old friends again, he knew that he could never veer from his trip. All pleasures of the mind and flesh would have to wait. As he traveled through his homeland, he purposely avoided any possible contact with his people. It was painful at times, but during this whole trek north from the waterfall, pain became his constant companion and his driving force. At times his pace became so frenzied that he would even travel through the night and most times through the hottest parts of the day, something that was not advisable in desert conditions. He even ran through various parts of his journey, thoroughly exhausting and dehydrating himself even before he crossed the invisible border into the United States. Finally, after several grueling months of travel at such an inhuman pace, he reached the southern part of Death Valley. Ironically, he could not go right into the valley. It wasn't so much that he didn't want to, but the valley seemed to be telling him that he would have to wait. This confused Grandfather, especially after such a long and rushed trip to get there. All the while he felt as if he were rushing to beat an unseen clock, only to be commanded to wait when he finally arrived. The only thing that he understood without a doubt was that he was not to enter the valley. He decided then to make camp, find food and water, rest, and await for the valley to command him to enter. He felt that it would be a good idea anyway to rest for a while, especially after such a grueling journey. He suspected that was the reason that the valley no longer beckoned. Several days passed without a sign from the desert valley. Grandfather's strength slowly returned, and physically he felt well rested. His spirit mind, however, would not rest and yearned to enter the valley. It became a struggle to wait, for at times his deepest desires for understanding obscured all other communication. He felt frustrated at times, for he knew that some unseen secret awaited him, and his anticipation became overwhelming. He wanted to know, yearned to finish the lesson of the waterfall. Finally, on the dawn of the seventh day, the valley called him again, and he knew that he could go in. In a way, it was a relief to finally enter the valley, but he was also a little afraid. He knew that he had to undertake this quest with nothing from the outside world, and wandering alone and naked in the desert would be trying indeed. This endless track of barren but beautiful wilderness gave him no clues as to where he had to go or what he had to do. Every time, day or night, that he tried to lie down and rest, or gather food, or find water, the call of the desert would not permit him. He was driven on, part by his own quest to find the answers and part by the very desert itself. With each passing mile he could feel his strength diminishing and his thirst intensifying. Still he pushed on into the heat of the day and the cold of the night, his body now racked with pain and his mind near hallucination from lack of water. He began to lose touch with all reality, so that all there was the intense thirst and pain. Yet his resolve to continue would not diminish. The goal of getting there, no matter where there was, became more important than the pain, even more important than death. By the beginning of the fifth day, he began to crawl. Walking or even standing became impossible. The sun seemed to burn with more intensity, and there was no place of shadow. He crawled on into the most horrible heat of the day, then finally collapsed with fatigue. There was no way he could go on, for now he could not even slide along on his belly. All he could do was to stay right where he lay, unable to move. His quest to find answers, his search for the truth, ultimately led him to the near edge of death. Even though he knew that he was going to ultimately die, he didn't care, for all he wanted was to find what he was looking for. If that search cost him his life, then he would have died in vain. He believed that his life was well worth the effort. As far as he was concerned, if he could not find the answer, then he would rather die. During this time, his grandfather was trapped in a stupor of thought. he failed to notice that the sky was beginning to cloud over. Grandfather was pulled back to consciousness by the feeling of a gentle rain. At first he thought that he might be hallucinating, for the first few drops felt like they were burning his flesh. As time passed, the rain intensified, but Grandfather did not move. Instead, he just lay where he was and cried, though he was so dehydrated that no tears fell from his eyes. It was as if the very desert had seen his desire for the wisdom and given him back his life. He rolled onto his back and felt the gentle rains running into his mouth. As each drop combined and rolled back into his throat, he could feel it fuse with his flesh. There was again no separation from his flesh to that of the waters. The lessons learned at the edge of the waterfall once again came hammering into his mind. Grandfather knew that the rains would not last long at this time of the year. In fact, they were rare indeed. He worked at gathering as much of the rainwater as he possibly could. He found several shallow basin-type rocks and collected the water, all the while keeping his mouth open to the sky as much as possible. He rushed around the landscape, trying to find as many basin-like rocks as possible, but soon, to his surprise, a large amount of water had collected in a huge tub-like depression alongside a small rock outcropping. He knew instantly that this would be the place where he would set up camp. It was here that the valley wanted him to be. He had shelter and enough water for at least a few days, and food was plentiful. A tremendous sense of relief rushed over him. He felt like he had been reborn from the fires of the desert. For the next month, at least, he lived a very Spartan existence. He wandered through the desert whenever he felt moved by the unseen spirit of the valley. Each trek away from the security of his camp, he learned something new, yet there was never a clear communication like that which he received from the waterfall. Even though he had been to the various deserts of the country many times before, he began to learn things that he had never known. The various animals and plants began to teach him small but valuable lessons about life and about living under the harsh conditions of the wilderness. Even the rocks had many things to teach, both on a physical and a spiritual level. However, the grand lessons that he came for still would not make themselves manifest. To him, the desert seemed to be waiting, but for what he did not know. Finally, when Grandfather least expected it, he received one of the first grand lessons that the desert had to teach. He was watching a lizard sunning itself in the early morning hours, awaiting the heat to drive away the chill of the night. He admired how easily the lizard seemed to live under such harsh conditions. There was always the possibility of a struggle to live if conditions got bad, but the lizard was part of the whole environment. These lizards were only found in the deserts under these conditions and could not exist in the higher elevations, in the forests, or even the grassy fields. They needed this place to survive and to live. To them, this place was home, and they accepted the torturous conditions without question. The lizards learned to live with the laws of the desert, and in so doing, it became home, their only home. He began, through the wisdom of what he had learned from the lizard, to look into his own life and how he viewed this desert valley. To him, at this point, a home, but still a struggle. He sensed that he might be an alien to this environment, struggling against its forces rather than giving in to them. If he could be like the lizard, then this place would become his home. There would be no struggle, for if the laws and conditions of the desert were obeyed, then the desert would truly become his home. He began to call this the philosophy of the lizard, and it was this philosophy that he wanted to define in his own terms. He wanted to make that philosophy part of his life, so it would direct his actions while in this place. Here, in the fires of the desert, he learned to appreciate water to its fullest. Here he could plainly see how every precious drop of water was so critical to the maintenance of life. These lessons were clear, but he still wanted to call this place home. He felt part of it all, though only spiritually. He wanted to become part of it through the flesh, as did the lizard, the various plants, and numerous other animals that call this place home. The more Grandfather searched his mind for answers, the more distant he felt from any real solutions as to how to call this place home. There must be a key element, a secret of some sort that he had to find. He resolved himself to solve that secret of the lizard philosophy and thus solve the question of the desert becoming home. Grandfather stayed around his camp area for several more weeks, studying the various wildlife and flora, especially the lizards, but still there was no clue as to where he could find the answer. He soon began to exhaust all possibilities and felt compelled again to push deeper into the desert, abandoning his camp and his protected but dwindling source of water. As soon as he thought about it, the feeling of having to leave immediately overwhelmed him. At first he thought of wandering back to his camp to take a last drink of water, but the feeling that he had to leave right away became very pressing. Without hesitation he wandered again into the desert, not knowing where he was going, but being driven definitely to a distant place. There was never a question in his mind about this compelling force. He had to follow this feeling no matter what the pain, if he ever hoped to find any answers. He knew that he may have to face death again, but his quest was more important than his life. Grandfather always believed that if his life quests were not worth giving up his life for, then the quest was not worthwhile at all. All too many people go through life dedicated to nothing that they would die for, and to him that was not really living at all, and, in so doing, a passion for living that few others could ever know. The truth, the simple truths of life, was what Grandfather was seeking. His seeking many times would lead him to the edge of death, but it was at this edge that the most profound lessons would be learned. Many times this was the only way they could be learned. Again he wandered for days, driven beyond pain and thirst to get to some unknown place of wisdom. Again he was brought to his knees and finally to the state of collapse. Still the desert remained a struggle, and except for a spiritual connection, he still felt alien. The pain and thirst were even more intense now than they had been during his first collapse. His body felt as if it were on fire, and his throat felt cracked and bleeding, like did his lips. No clouds could be seen in the sky. There was no relief to be had this time. The desert valley had forsaken him, and even the spirit refused to speak. His prayers seemed to fall upon deaf ears, and now he felt so alone and rejected. It was almost as if the desert were deliberately trying to cast him out, or even kill him. He remembered awakening in the night and again in the day. Another night passed, then another day, or at least he thought so. His mind wandered in and out of reality. Time became a myth, and place became but a dream. Several times he hallucinated water. At one point in the early morning he felt what he thought was dew on a close rock, only to burn his tongue as he attempted to lick the searing hot surface. He awoke to the feel of stinging rain hitting his back. He at first thought that it was yet another hallucination, but soon began to feel its reality come hammering through into his consciousness. Opening his lips to the sky, he began to catch water, and as his strength began to return, he began to collect the waters any way he could, just as before. Unfortunately, there were no convenient rock catch basins, and he had to satisfy himself with drinking as much water as he possibly could hold. Just at the point where he could not physically hold any more water, the rains abruptly stopped, and soon after, the sky began to clear. It was not long before the sun pounded down on the earth again, turning the desert into an inferno. There were no rock overhangs where he could find shelter. In fact, there was not much of anything. He was in one of the most barren places that he had ever been to in his life. Squinting through the wavering lines of heat, he could see no areas of shelter in any direction, no place where he could find safety. At this point, he knew that he had to make a decision. Either he would have to try to make it back to his original camp and there find shelter, or he would have to wait here for the answers to his questions. Ultimately, his body would run out of water, and then he would not be able to make the long trek back to his original camp. He searched the sky for answers, but it remained mute. He sought the spirits for answers, but they refused to speak. He had to make a decision and fast, either to make the long journey back to his original camp or ultimately face death. Simply, he had to abandon his quest and live, or await answers and possibly die. The urge inside of him was to go back to the safety of his camp, but he knew that was not what his spirit wanted. As always, when faced with a life-or-death situation, the decision did not take long. He would rather face the possibility of death than to abandon his quest. He reaffirmed his decision in his prayers, and almost immediately he sensed something change and shift deep within him. It was like a sense of knowing something, but he did not know what. As if born of some fantasy or dream, he saw a small lizard disappear under a large rock. From this position, the rock appeared to be stuck solidly in the ground, but when he walked over to it, that was not the case. The rock was embedded in the ground, but only on 3 sides. In front of the rock was a deep depression that he could not see from where he sat. The depression cut deep into the desert floor, and under the rock, it afforded a rather spacious cave, one he could actually sit up in. To his amazement, the lower portion of the small cave had collected a good supply of water from the passing rain. He soon found that it was probably enough water to last him several days. At that moment, he felt so at peace, so at ease, as if he were nearly home. He wept at the thought that the small lizard had led him to this place. The desert was taking care of its own, and through the lizard he had been saved. He was formally introduced to the desert valley by the lizard, and now the desert would allow him to live a little longer. The desert began to feel more like a home, a place where he actually belonged. Yet there was still a separation and a piece of that puzzle that was missing. He also did not know why this feeling came over him. It was something felt rather than conscious thought. It was obvious to him that he had learned a profound lesson, but he wanted to find out why and put it into a language that his mind could comprehend. He knew that the metamorphosis of a feeling shifting to thought would not always happen. Many things could not be known, but there was no logical explanation attached to that knowing. He realized that he may just have to accept the shift in his perception of the desert and not allow himself the luxury of knowing why. Anyway, the feeling was real enough, for his body and mind now found peace on a deep level. It was not a spiritual change, for spiritually he always felt part of the desert. It was a definite physical changing of body and mind, small but profound. He sat back in his small cave for a long moment of reflection, pleased at just knowing the change had happened. Days slipped by as he stayed in and around this cave. He began to see the desert not as a barren and hostile place, but a place of infinite life. It was a place not harsh and dry, but a place that took care of its own on its own terms. Everything that lived and grew in this place belonged here and nowhere else. He, too, began to feel that he somehow belonged. Certainly, he had seen countless living things existing in various desert conditions all of his life, but for the first time he viewed those things differently. He had looked at life on the desert as a constant, agonizing struggle for all of its inhabitants, but now he knew that there was no real struggle at all, at least no more so than would be found in any other environment. All anything that lived here would have to do was to obey the laws of the desert. It would have to redefine the terms of survival to fit exactly into the consciousness of the whole. Thus the whole becomes the living. He began to feel the same wisdom of the waterfall now in the desert valley. The valley, with its torturous heat, lack of water, and emptiness, was actually a living, conscious entity that became part of his flesh and consciousness. Like the waterfall, the desert moved within his flesh, and he within the flesh of the desert. There was no inner or outer dimension, no separation of self, just the whole, the oneness of it all. That knowledge became almost overwhelming, too much for him to understand all at once. He reveled in the grand lessons. His outward search of the land became an inward search of the land. He understood finally that thirst did not mean pain and death. They were the reality of the desert, a gift of life in disguise. It was the intense thirst that led one to survive like any other instinct. It was the thirst that sharpened the physical and spiritual senses of survival, for the desert allowed no mistakes. The knowledge of thirst thus became the cutting edge of the survivor. The thirst kept one conscious of the frailty of life in this place. Frail, yes, but a struggle? No. Grandfather finally understood one of the most basic and precious laws of living with the desert. That thirst is an ally, not an adversary. From that day on in the desert, Grandfather used his thirst as a guiding force in his survival. Like all the other children of the desert, he began to grow very conscious of water. He began to redefine heat and thirst. They were soon accepted as part of the overall reality, and once accepted, they were transcended. They lost their power, for they became a constant part of one's existence here. After all, Grandfather thought, without the heat and thirst, there could be no living entity called desert. Like the very desert, in the heat and the thirst, he found a certain beauty, the beauty that is part of it all. As all of these things began to fuse together in Grandfather's mind, he began to understand the desert like never before. With each passing day, he felt more and more at home. Old definitions were abandoned, and new realities were beginning to make themselves known. Grandfather began to blend his existence into a perfect harmony with the rhythms of the desert. Soon, there was no struggle in his mind or in his flesh. He finally belonged, accepting the desert on its own terms and learning to live in balance with its laws. He had nearly died in the desert, but only the alien had died, only to be reborn as a child of this land. For the first time, Rick and I could clearly understand why Grandfather was not affected by the heat and the thirst. It was not that he did not feel them, for he did. He, unlike us, did not fear or fight them, for they were part of the realities of life. He knew them to be precious gifts of life that were a keen driving force in survival. Thirst thus becomes the doorway through which we can see into the heart of the deserts, and more important, see into the heart of ourselves. Thirst and heat, then, are teachers. not purveyors of pain and suffering, but that which frees and enlightens, if we know how to accept and use these gifts. Certainly, both Rick and I had been thirsty many times since, but the thirst had lost its power over us. To us, the thirst no longer prevented us from enjoying, but rather it enabled us to enjoy much more. Each time we were thirsty, we learned from it, especially the lessons about ourselves and our perceptions of those things around us. Thirst was a reality of life, one we could accept and redefine as a tremendous teacher. Thirst was real, and we learned to love everything real.